Let's begin this morning with prayer. Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner, and help us all to consider what it is that we bring to this table of work when it comes to our own sinfulness. Help us not only to understand what your scriptures teach, but also to understand our own implications for the life that we live and the jobs that we do. We give you thanks for yourself, your Son, your Spirit, and your scriptures. Amen. Vocation is ministry, and as we have suggested since the beginning, we have a responsibility that's been God-given to us. Our work, no matter what we do, matters to God, and our jobs well done show our love for others. This week, however, we have to deal with this topic: work sucks. This actually comes from the New Republic headline. There's a whole series of articles, by the way, that goes along with this. If you're so inclined, you can check these things out at the New Republic. This episode 5, The Trauma of Sin on Work. Now, for those of you who've been following along, this is probably an abrupt shift from last week when we talked about joy at work. Well, ain't no joy today. We are taking the hard left turn here and dealing with the topic as we find it. Difficult one as it is. Now, considering that this is a whole series of articles at the New Republic, I thought it would also be important to acquaint you with Zippia if you're not so inclined to see this kind of web page. This is the career expert, and they give us 10 signs about why your work might suck. Here are 4 of them. You're miserable, you hate your coworkers, you give more than you get, and there is no upward mobility. So if you have any of these 4, plus there's 6 more for you to investigate, go to Zippia the 5th of October of this year and see what else is new there. This is something that is ongoing. We are constantly dealing with new kinds of data that are rolling out. Now I know that there's a different kind of data that rolled out on Friday, but it does not line up with the stats here. 47,000 people were laid off in September. Just let that sink in for a moment. And then 605,000 in the first 9 months of 2023. The most since 2009. You remember the Great Recession. So 2023, according to Fortune magazine, has been a bloodbath. And I do apologize for the use of that word, considering what happened in Israel yesterday. This was something that was done ahead of that particular event and the atrocities that are happening to the Israelis in Israel. But this is what Fortune magazine suggests to us. Now, we don't stop there. We also see a connection to other parts of culture. FOBO used to mean fear of being left out. Now, according to headlines, it's the fear of becoming obsolete. Why might that be? Because artificial intelligence is replacing jobs and the population's concerned. I mean, I've been thinking about this ever since ChatGPT came out, and the implications of, hey, why don't you just have ChatGPT take the place of Eckel in the classroom about how to write and read. In fact, you don't even need the student, you just have them plug that in, and they're able to read and write. Of course, the third part of the title of my course is Inquiry. The student will no longer be able to think, but that's a whole different discussion. So, we see that these kinds of things are making the rounds. This is from Gallup just this last month. I think it's important for us to recognize that these kinds of concerns really are concerns for the population. So how do we deal with this coming from the book of Genesis? Well, the book of Genesis is kind of prescient. You know, it kind of gives us what's going to happen once sin enters into the picture. And there are 4 basic contextual relationships or 4 different kinds of relationships that take place, especially in verses 17 to 19. And I want to just kind of give a flyover of these, and then we're going to, as Pastor Scott usually says, we're going to dig deep on some of these ideas. So the first relationship is contextual, and the whole idea, and these are verses 17 through 19, the verses immediately after the people have sinned, Adam and Eve have sinned, and God lays down the law against the serpent. and then gives the consequences of what's going to happen to the woman and childbirth and all of that. And now we get to the man. So 17 to 19 is all about what's happening to work in particular. And the key word here is the word you. We'll say more about this in a moment. But the whole contextual relationship has to do with it's our fault. I'm sure I've said this before at some juncture in the past, but with apologies to Billy Joel, we did start the fire. So the idea is that we indeed bear responsibility. The next relationship is vertical. That is our response to God. So 7 through 8, this is where Adam and Eve literally try to hide themselves from what's going on. Horizontal relationships, our response to each other. And the great response is always the same. You did it. The serpent, the woman, there's always finger pointing going on. And then verse 16, and we'll say some more about verse 16. And then vocational relationships, and this is our response to the ground. What happens to the ground is going to happen to us. So, let's begin there. Cursed is the ground because of you, until you return to the ground, since from it you were taken, for dust you are, and to dust you will return. And notice the implications here. 14 times in these verses, the word you is used. You don't need to know Hebrew to know this. It's right there in the English translation. The concept here is that it's our problem. That you were brought from the earth. Remember, God created out of the dust of the ground, chapter 2, verse 5. And at the same time, because of our sin, we are going back to the earth, and that is a real problem for us. Now, we could talk about any number of movies that deal with this. There's an older one called Swimming with Sharks. There are all different kinds of movies that deal with issues of office issues, such as Office Space, or 9 to 5, or Norma Rae. Pick one of those great films, and I think I've actually included those on the handout this morning, and you can take it from there. Now, this is not simply to suggest that the problem is always with business. Sometimes the problem is with the employees. So look at this. I was just fascinated by this article in Fortune. Gen Z workers are not afraid to talk about their salaries or tell their bosses what they think of them. Now, here's where I'd like to pause and tell you about some of my experiences as a professor at the public university, where my students have no problem telling me about everything, including what they think of me at times. Now, most of it has to do with fun stuff, like, the very first thing I do when I go into class is I lift my pant leg so that they can see my socks. So there you go, there's my socks for the day. They love this thing, they love the authenticity. And then, of course, we're comparing socks, and I really have to try to measure up now because the whole problem of mismatched socks is now a thing. So you wear one kind of sock on one foot and another kind of sock on another foot, and I'm telling you, I can't even keep up anymore. Anyway, thank you. I'm thinking about launching that stand-up career anytime soon now. So Gen Z workers are not afraid of telling their bosses. What does that tell us? That tells us that bosses are afraid, because there's all kinds of legal implications for such issues. So anyway, Fortune, go check that article out if you're so inclined. These are the kinds of things that folks are putting up with in the workplace. And why is this? Because you have. So the very first consequence of sin on work is that what was created for our benefit now works against us. So the very thing that was given to us, work is good. Remember, we talked about this last week. Joy at work means that work was given to us as a benefit, but now it's turned on us. Why is that? Because of our sin. You are the problem, as Genesis tells us here. And there are all kinds of references to this throughout Scripture. Very first consequence of sin. So think about this. This happens in every single kind of relationship. The first thing that suffers is whatever we are enjoying, whatever we're good at, because sin will raise its ugly head no matter where we are or what we are doing. Hence this headline. This is from 20-something Finance, January of this year. The U.S. is the most overworked developed nation. So the very good thing that we have, our work, is the very thing that suppresses us, namely that we are overworked. Good, what does sin do? It always makes something bad. So, again, check these kinds of concepts out if you're so inclined, because they line up with Genesis. Genesis 3 tells us about the world in which we live. You don't even really need to read the newspaper. I mean, if anybody here reads newspapers anymore, you don't even need to read the news, because we already have the basis for the news in Genesis chapter 3. Speaking of which, Adam, 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 Adam. Now, why do I say it that way? Because that's how you pronounce it in Hebrew. It's not Adam, it's Adam. And the concept behind this is that it's the same word for ground. Well, isn't this interesting? So I need to read this slide because it's, the power of these verses is just so important. After sin, maintenance of the ground brought with it hardship and relocation for production. Before sin, food came up from the ground. After sin, man would go down to the ground. The ground we once stood on, we now go under. However, while the ground was cursed, man was not. So the implications for us, when we stop to think about what sin has done, it has permeated everything. There's not one area of life that has not in some way or another been affected negatively by sin, and specifically within the realm of our discussion during this particular class on work. And we shouldn't be surprised at this next slide either, because we are concerned about creational care. But what happens? When sin enters the picture, there are consequences. So I don't know how long it's been since you've cracked open the book of Leviticus, but it's my second favorite book. So please go ahead and do that every once in a while. Just, tell me, text me, hey, Mark, I just looked at Leviticus today. You give me a smile for my day. So in Leviticus chapter 26, we see the consequences of relationships when Israel disobeys God. And it's fascinating. This phrase is repeated 7 times in Leviticus 26. If you don't listen, if you don't listen, if you don't listen. So over and over and over again, we're told, if you don't listen, and the consequences are always amped up. So the consequences go up as our sin goes up. Leviticus 26. We shouldn't be surprised by this. And also Deuteronomy 11. What does it say when you leave the commands of God? In this case, this whole section, Deuteronomy 11, 13 to 17, is about God will stop the rain from falling. In other words, the harvest will be lost. There will no longer be any production because of this. So, remember what Paul says in Romans chapter 8, that the creation groans as a woman in childbirth. This is the emphasis here. There are always going to be consequences on the created elements all around us. So, should we be surprised at this slide? CBS News reported just this week, it's not the glass ceiling that's the problem for women, but it's the broken rung. I had never heard of this before. The broken rung. And what does that mean? It simply means that when you start in entry-level positions, you usually work your way up. But according to this stat, women don't always make it to the next level simply because they're not being promoted. Oftentimes, of course, people would suggest that the reason is because of gender inequalities. May well be. But the point here is that the glass ceiling isn't really the issue, according to CBS News and some others. And so what can we say about this from Genesis? We're not surprised at this. It's something that needs to be overcome and dealt with, and something that needs to be overturned, frankly, but nonetheless is something that we live with because of sin in work. So, through painful toil, another one of these great phrases here in 17 through 19 in Genesis chapter 3. The word sorrow in these verses, that work will now produce sorrow, is the same word that's used for childbirth in 3:15. That means that the pain of the woman will now, in childbirth, will now be the pain of everybody at work. So this issue of what will the work or the earth produce, it's going to give it up reluctantly. Fascinating statement here. This concept about eating in Genesis chapter 3, 17 to 19 is mentioned 5 times in 3 verses. The idea of what you will eat. And the consequence of sin's action is that you're going to eat the fruit of your work, which, according to this, within the context of sin, isn't always all that great. And you're going to be doing this for how long? All of your life. This is something that's going to be ongoing. You shouldn't be surprised at this. This is going to be from the womb to the tomb. We are going to endure the consequences of sin on work. Anybody have a happy face yet this morning? What we're discussing? I told you, man, this is going to be tough. This is a total shift and change from last week. But it is indeed the world in which we live. So, lest we think that, again, this is just in Genesis, check this out. I found out this week, I had never been on Reddit before. It's not my go-to place. But on Reddit, there is a whole section of people who are anti-work. Now, my first thought when I read something like this is 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, where Paul says, if you don't work, you don't eat. I mean, it's just kind of like a normal, obvious thing to any of us who are reading the Scriptures. But there's a whole anti-work rebellion, which really comes from a worldview that suggests, you know what, the government's going to take care of us. And a socialistic view of governmental top-down oversight is going to care for all of us. Why should we work when we can get free money? Well, that's a whole discussion by itself, the whole issue of economics and all of the things that are invested there. We could talk about the new monetary issues that take place in governmental processes today. But this is an issue. And by the way, there's an anti-work group. So they post just as much as the anti-work group posts. Fascinating stuff. So I wrote the word ongoing here because there was no date for this. It's just people constantly talk about how bad their work is and why they shouldn't have to work any longer and so on and so forth. Well, take that for what it's worth. It is something that is ongoing in our culture. So what is all this going to produce? It's going to produce thorns and thistles. So the same word, this production word that's used in 2:5, which is pre-fall, before sin, this same idea is now something that's going to prompt the growth of thorns and thistles, now because of human sin. So all of the negatives that we have, all of the thorns and thistles of our lives, think about whatever it is that bugs you about your job and the stuff that you have to put up with. Genesis speaks to that issue because it helps us to understand all of this comes from human sin. And I love this song, and I love this movie, at least the first 5 minutes. If you've never seen the first 5 minutes of Joe versus the Volcano, yes, it stars Tom Hanks. There is a reason to go watch this. Meg Ryan's in it too. There's another reason to watch this. Joe versus the Volcano, the first 5 minutes. It is the most depressing 5 minutes of film I can think of. Here's this guy walking into work, and they're all trudging in, and it's this awful place to work. And I won't tell you what they produce there because it'll put a smile on your face when you find out. But this is the song that's being played during those first 5 minutes. Tennessee Ernie Ford, you load 16 tons, what do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt. St. Peter, don't you call, because I can't go. Oh, my soul, to the company store. So wherever it is that you work, whoever it is that you may work for, the implications of the negativity of these kinds of things continue, which might cause us to say something like this stinks, which literally, by the way, is Hebrew. So check this out. Thorns, the word thorns means a loathing, repulsion, and odious, something that has an odor to it. Thistles means trampling, treading, and dominating. And the only other time that this thing is used, this word is used, is in the whole context of judgment, where literally the creation is overrunning everything because of human sin. So when you hear the phrase, this stinks, you're actually speaking Hebrew. Oh, all right, there you go. Thank you. I guess I'll put stand up on hold. This stinks. Now, why do we say that? And is there any connection to culture? All the time, every place. Check this out. There is a new kind of blacklist. As soon as I read this article, I'm thinking of Joseph McCarthy in the 1950s. But no, This is brand new, kind of different blacklist altogether, because employees are calling out employers, and they literally have a list of companies that you shouldn't work for because of, well, you can fill in the blank. What fascinated me about this wasn't the fact that there's a blacklist. I just kind of shook my head when I wrote it. What I would like to see is blacklist 2, where employers tell, here are the employees you shouldn't hire. Because it really needs to go both ways. It's not just a one-way street. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but my point and emphasis is that, hey, you know what? Sometimes bad things happen at work. And here's a group of folks who are going to tell you what those bad things might actually be. Now, we used to think when we're reading the book of Genesis that, hey, you know what? When God says you will eat from the plants of the field, what's the problem there? That phrase, by the way, occurs in this chapter 3, 17 to 19. And the emphasis of this eating from the plants of the field isn't the cool stuff that you hadn't eaten, like you walked around and you're looking at all the fruit on the trees going, oh man, I think I'll have an avocado today. No, now plants of the field means you got to bend over and dig for it, man. You can't just pluck it off the limb. No, now you got to break your back to do the burden of work. That's the reason, the implication for these kinds of ideas. And just by the way, for sake of saying this, I think I say it every Sunday, but I'll repeat myself yet again today. All of these things are on the handout, so you don't have to take a note. Everything, all of these slides, except for the illustrative slides, are actually on the handout. So here's another one of those illustrious slides. Just read this week. Again from Fortune. Older millennials are in a constant state of playing catch-up, the most financially strapped of any age group. Wow. Fascinating stuff when you stop to consider the economic implications for what we are in 2023. When you stop to consider what this is doing to families, what does this mean for any kind of stress in relationships? What does this mean even for giving in a church, in a congregational church? All of these things matter, and in one way or another, sin has produced these kinds of issues. So again, back to Genesis, here's a phrase, by the sweat of your brow you will eat. Now, sweat is close to another Hebrew word, which means a stench or a foul odor. So if you're at all interested in the whole concept of deodorant, you might consider this. But there are all different kinds of sweat. It's not simply the physical sweat. So this slide from Gallup, U.S. workers fear technology is making their jobs obsolete. So there's a different kind of sweating going on in the offices of our day, when there might not be any work because artificial intelligence is going to displace workers. Just as an aside, it strikes me to say, it would be really good to read some dystopian novels from time to time. So, I did Gothic horror literature for a long time, and then I was in a MA program downtown at IUPUI where I studied all kinds of different kinds of literature. And one of the pieces that I did in an assignment was to do dystopian literature, which is the kind of thing where you're looking at this awful Armageddon-like, think of the Matrix in the worst kind of way. This is the kind of literature that's being produced by science fiction writers who are saying, look, this is something bad, we're heading this direction, beware. Well, when you stop to think about artificial intelligence and its implications through science fiction literature, it's something to consider, and not something, by the way, to sidestep. Actually, literature has an awful lot to teach us about real life. Genesis gives us the principles, and sometimes literature will flesh them out for us. So, let's talk about some applications, some what-ifs. What if I have a job where I'm bored? Remember a couple of weeks ago, I raised the question about what happens if I have a job that I don't like. And sometimes, according to 1 Timothy 5:8, for instance, it says that if you don't provide for your family, that you're worse than an infidel. Well, the whole point of this is to simply say that sometimes you do things that you don't want to do or because you have to do them. Yeah, well, that's true. Scripture's clear about that too. And why is that? Well, because sin has somehow been invested in the place and in the work that you're at. My job doesn't meet my expectations. I had an administrator once. I have quoted him so many times on this very point. I'll never forget, I can still see him standing in front of me, and he said, "How much can you live with? Do you need 70%? Do you have to have 70% of what you get? Can you live with 60? What happens if it's an even 50-50? What can you live with?" he asked. I think it's applicable across the board in all kinds of situations. What happens if my business fails and my work doesn't work? That's a whole discussion about being unemployed, and happy to talk about those issues. Drudgery, difficulty, the problem of doing something that we might not like. And be careful not to think that work is simply a means to an end, rather work with an end in sight. So we talked a couple weeks ago about the importance of telos, or what is the end or the outcome of whatever it is that we're invested in. So whatever we do, don't be surprised by work's pain. This is going to be a lifetime of that. And it's not something that any of us might look forward to, but we can anticipate it and understand it because Scripture clearly teaches this. Well, I'll just give myself as a personal example, and I'll say to you what the slide says. I love to teach and I hate to teach. So when I am there doing my thing, teaching, like even now, I love this. I love being in the moment of teaching. But preparing these slides? You got to be kidding me, man. I don't like that at all. It takes huge amounts of time to do this and to actually put it all together and all of those. So there are do I hate teaching sometimes? Yeah. Do I love teaching sometimes? Yeah. But I also know that's my gift and I'm supposed to be doing this. And obviously I'm my own worst enemy. I'm my own worst enemy when it comes to putting stuff off and trying to do too many things. I mean, we could go in lots of directions there. The very thing we might enjoy about our workplace may be the very thing we loathe about our workplace. So, yeah, you know what? It's feeding me. I'm getting an income from this. And yet at the same time, I'm realizing, man, there's so much junk I got to deal with, And you go home and you tell your spouse about all of these negatives, and these are real issues, real problems. So the problems at work may often be brought on by ourselves. And we like to do this, don't we? I mean, this goes back to Genesis 3, 9-13, where the man says, it's the woman's problem. Or the woman says, it's the serpent that made me do this. Well, in this case, we're always pointing at somebody else instead of perhaps rectifying the very place and our responsibilities we find ourselves in. So I've mentioned a couple times that we were going to get back to this, and I want to say a couple of words about employees and employers. If you go to Genesis 3:16, the verse there says, and this is very specific about the man and the woman, that the woman will want to have oversight or literally usurp control from the man, and man will want to subjugate the woman. Now, without going into great detail about what all of that means, let me just give a flyover of this. Yes, it's specifically about the man and the woman in the garden, but the application for this idea is universal from Genesis 3. And here's the problem. We want to get over on everybody else because we want control. We don't like being told what to do. And so the implication for Adam and Eve is the implication for every single relationship in life. So go back to one of the earlier slides where I talked about our horizontal relationships. This is a horizontal between people. The problem for us is that this thing goes both ways. That the woman wants control, that the man wants control, the employer wants control, the employee wants control. Fill in the blanks on any of those kinds of relationships. So, what does the employer do? The employer suggests that, you know what? The great question, somebody I worked for said this to me, and I still can't stand it. What have you done for me lately? Oh, man. What an awful thing to say to somebody who works for you. The question there only points to your production. So now I view you simply as somebody, as a producer. I feel like I'm in a socialistic economy here when I'm treated that way. Or I'm untrustworthy, so I'm dishonest with what happens. And I could tell you lots of stories about this where literally people who were my superiors in lots of different workplaces, and by the way, I've been in Christian workplaces, I have had people who are my superiors take my ideas and pass them off as their own. Now, does this happen everywhere? Yes. But I'm just telling you, it's happened to me too. My point and emphasis is plagiarism is universal. It doesn't just happen in the English class. So, sometimes employers can be uncommunicative. Yep. This isn't something that you need to know about. Maybe that's true for certain periods and certain issues. Employees don't need to know everything. At the same time, that doesn't mean the door is always closed. And the employee, oh my, I could launch into a long list of things here. I've listed lazy, procrastinator, complainer, and thief. You mean employees steal from their employers? Well, come on. What world are you living in if you haven't thought about that? I mean, people have, really turned up the screws on their employers. Stuff walks out the door all the time. Hence, G.K. Chesterton's famous line when asked, what's wrong with the world? He said, I am. I'm the problem. So the issue really begins with each one of us. Remember, you being repeated 15 times in those verses. So, I know, Mark, this is just really abysmal. I don't know if I can take any more of this teaching today. I really would rather run for the doors at this moment. Is there any hope? Well, let's give some, shall we? Noah, Genesis chapter 5. What does it say? Noah shall comfort us concerning the work and toil of our hands because of the ground which the Lord has cursed. So what's Noah going to do? He's going to bring hope. This book, by the way, Defiant Gardens, the subtitle is Making Gardens During Wartime, is really interesting. I listed this in your handout as well. But even in the awfulness of whatever may face us, in whatever context, there is always going to be the seed of hope, and certainly was true in Genesis chapter 5. Now, one of the things I like to talk about with people as it relates to leadership is this concept of FAN, flexible, agile, and nimble. So I came up with this some time ago. In fact, I have a series of three sessions for leaders on this, and what does it mean to have a what box kind of leadership. You know how people say, well, you think outside the box? And there's a long story to this, but when somebody said that to me one time, I said, what box? I haven't seen the box. Where's the box? Show me the box. There is no box. So there's no outside of the box thinking, so the title of this series is What Box Leadership. And I don't do this very often, but I'll just say it's on my website, markuckel.com, if you're so inclined. But I'm emphasizing the flexible, agile, nimble. Every single one of us, because of the kinds of things we have to put up with, have to be flexible, agile, nimble. It's part of perseverance, which we talked about at an episode or two ago. What did William Wilberforce say? Remember, he was the great man in England who stopped the slave trade after about 30 years of trying. He contemplated leaving politics to pursue some sphere of Christian service. We are to consider our peculiar situations, and in these to do all the good we can. You've never heard me say, do good, do good, do good, have you? It would merit no better name than desertion if I were thus to fly from the post where Providence has placed me. Oh, my word. You mean somebody as august as William Wilberforce, who did this marvelous thing, literally subverting slavery in the 19th century in England. Took him over 30 years to do so. But he was thinking about going into Christian ministry. Thank God that he did not, because of the work that he did. So there are lots of pieces of hope, mercy in the midst of consequence. Even childbirth produces the next generation. So the work produces sustenance for people, and when we practice our vocation, we actually practice this commandment, loving others, because we have a love for God. So even in giving birth to the next generation suggests hope. Which brings me to our work story of the day. And by the way, don't forget, my email is there. Please, if you have a work story you'd like to share, I'll share it anonymously or your first name or whatever, but I love reading these work stories. So this work story is entitled 5 Cows. And as I have in the past weeks, I need to read this from a sheet. Years ago, I fell in love with a cattle rancher. He was actually a former cattle rancher and a former undercover cop and U.S. Marshal. Yib Boney, Florida Cracker, is the reason I love cows. By the way, all of the names have been changed to protect the innocent, or in some cases, the guilty. Our love affair was Civil War reenactment. I was a well-bred Yankee woman, and he was a slow-talking, tobacco-spitting Southern man. I love how Polly writes. He painted an irresistible picture of raising cattle. He was also a former truck driver, so he was also a cattle hauler. He was also old at the time and had no interest in indulging my interest in cows. Now, by the way, this is all coming back at the end of the story, so hang in there. Years later, I bought 5 cows. Notice the slide. I found one with 5 cows. I bought 5 cows outside of a refugee camp somewhere in Africa. While I do not own these cows, I gave one as a wedding gift and 4 as the unacceptably insufficient dowry to represent the largest payment I could muster to buy the freedom of a woman who would have been sold to the highest bidder. July 2017, a missionary from our church returned to tell us about their work in Africa. He said, "God broke my heart with the refugees. They are dying of curable diseases. They are alone without hope. They just want somebody to listen to their story." Then he asked us to close our eyes and raise our hand if we deeply desired the Lord to use us for his purposes. With tears streaming down my face, I raised both hands, silently told the Lord, I am just the right person to listen to their stories. 6 weeks later, I received a Facebook message from Jerry asking for my help to share the stories of refugee youth for all the world to know. Jerry and family became my family, and I am now a grandmother to 4. Fast forward to 2022, and Facebook dings again. A young colleague of Jerry's reached out with a different sort of writing assignment. He wants to be an impactful journalist in order to tell the world about the forgotten African refugee. Meet Tim. He is a young man of 25 who has lived in a refugee camp in the middle of nowhere, Africa, for 20 of his 24 years. He is from a war-torn section of an African nation. In February 2022, he sent me this message. "Hello, I am from Africa. Would you love my friend request? I would really love to share something with you." Intrigued, I accepted and asked how I could help him. He said, "I'm a friend of Jerry and have also been in the same community forums with him. I read how you struggled to relieve him of the pain he went through in Africa. I see humanity in you, and I got the courage to message you." So for 6 years, I have listened to countless stories of heartbreak and suffering. My prayer journal is full of countless prayer requests. I have seen miracles, and I have suffered the silence of unanswered prayers and suffering that continues unabated. The cultures are complicated and the customs bizarre by American standards. But no matter these differences, these boys love Jesus, and they have the same hopes and dreams that we do. Tim wants to get married. He must provide an acceptable dowry of 50 cows to the father of the bride. It is laughable, really. The cost for 1 cow is impossible, but 50 cows is out of reach for these refugees, who are literally being starved to death in the camps with the reduced food rations from the UN. The father knows, however, that his college-educated, beautiful young daughter would bring somewhat of means to purchase his daughter's hands in marriage. Those with this kind of money would most likely be traffickers, and at the least would not be men of faith, honor, and integrity. The girl has no say in the matter. In my brilliant American wisdom, I suggested Tim run and get the girl from nowhere, Africa, and elope. The penalty for this would have been life-altering. He would have been chased, jailed, and killed. This would have erased his career plans to be a journalist. Come to think of it, being a journalist will most likely get him chased, jailed, and killed. Enter Plan B. I told Tim I would give wedding gift of 1 cow. He was overjoyed. But to accept the wedding gift, he had to get married, and to get married, he had to present an acceptable dowry. We talked about raising cattle for months. Can you imagine this thing across Facebook, this kind of discussion? We're raising cattle for months over Facebook. I did learn from my short stint of cattle ranching when I ran away to Kansas, see, the story's coming back again, that you can borrow a bull in order to grow your herd. For those of you on the farm understand such things, we'll take that no further. Thank you. Tim's eyes bugged out at such a suggestion, but the idea grew on him. Eventually, I pledged a total of 5 cows and knew that with a good borrowed bull, he could have 10 cows by spring. Sorry, this is just so good. I love this story. 5 cows represented 10% of the requested dowry. I looked at it as my personal tithe for God to use to buy the freedom for one of his children so that they could marry and honor him with a proper marriage. And while it would seem it would take 10 years to produce the dowry, there are a few cultural strings that may be pulled. I cannot easily tell anyone that I am buying cows for someone I have never met in a country I would never visit because the Lord wants me to work through me. Africa is a land of con men and criminals. Many think I am being swindled. I could probably be locked up for this, as most people think. I have become unhinged and radically irresponsible. Just put it on my tombstone, she says. Think carefully, she ends, when you are asked to raise your hand if you desire the Lord to use you for his purposes, and be doubly careful about raising both hands. What a story. What a writer. She's really good. So, with that, some questions. There's a roving mic up front. If anybody wants to be brave and come and grab it, feel free. Here are the questions of the day, and you may have your own. How do we show appreciation for institutions, though fraught with sin, which maintain a structure and organization of life which we can count on? There's that, can you live with 70% question. Why do we tend to point at certain areas, ideas, people, functions, or structures as out of bounds for Christians when they are part of the created order? This goes back to something last week I talked about boxes and bars, and I've always contended that we need more Christian bartenders. I am serious. Number 3, what if my job is monotonous, boring, tedious, a drudgery? What if my job is not fulfilling, not my gifting, not suiting me? We've emphasized some of those ideas this morning. The questions to ask: who has God made me? Where has God placed me? I'm thinking about Polly here. When has God allowed me to live, and what has God given me to do? Could be over Facebook. And how can my attitude be changed about work instead of trying to change my work? And with that, I'll ask if there are any questions. We didn't get a roving person this morning to rove the mic. Any questions? Please do consider sending me your work stories. Again, emails at the bottom of the page, on the handouts. I would love to hear from you, and I will take whatever story you give me and work it into our next sessions. We are coming up on the concept of rest soon enough. We have done now 5 out of the 12 sessions, so we're getting to the midway point. I would love to have more work stories to tell. Thanks for being here today. See you next week.